We come now to our fourth study here at the Californian Camp 1983. This is 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon. Turn it on or something else. I'm going to turn right back to the further study of the principle that obedience is the first and greatest requirement. Naturally, of course, these thoughts are a further development of the message on God's Sabbath rest, which message must be learned very thoroughly by God's people as we move down to the closing conflict, when the principles of righteousness shall be finally and fully tested and God's work brought to its end. Isn't it a bit loud? Turn it down a bit. Now, in our last study period, we were considering the witness of Jesus Christ on the mountain of temptation, and how he was victorious because he refused to move without God's specific orders, in which he trusted and by which he gained victory over the powers of darkness. Now at this point I'd like to turn to a very, very brief consideration of the principles of training children. As I said last night, while at the camp meeting in Canada, I saw some things I'd never seen before in regard to this matter. Now the Bible says, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old he will not depart from it. Train up a child in the way that he should go. Now what way? Very obviously, of course, is that? It is God's way, not man's way. We want to see as the final result of our bringing up of our children a child who obeys God because it is in him to do it, not because he's forced to do it, not because he's compelled to do it. We refer you again to the Statement and Desire of Ages 668 in this connection, which I read this morning, but I want to read it now in greater detail still. And the word begins with the expression that all true obedience comes from where? From the heart. All true obedience comes from the heart. There are two ways of producing obedience. One is by force and by fear, and the other is by, love. The other is by the implanting of a divine principle in the young child's life. And of course, the parent in the home, like God above, is possessed of vastly superior power to that of the child, physically speaking. And if he knows how to wield this power, the parent can most certainly induce from the child a very, very definite state of obedience, which of course is far better than anarchy or lawlessness or such like as it may be. And there was a time, of course, when before the Character of God message came, that I believed in making certain that we did use our authority as parents to induce obedience from the child. But it's been proved in the Word of God that when obedience is forced from a person in whom the spirit of obedience is not present, that enforcement of obedience will always produce for certain a spirit of rebellion. Always. It's always the result in the end. And how invariably we've seen families where the children have been educated to obey because of the threat of punishments by the sheer authority of the parents. But when that child finally gains his own freedom, then what happens to all the things that he was forced to do before? We find these young folk very often become the most worldly young people in their society, and certainly abandon the principles that their fathers and mothers taught them, or tried to teach them. The objective then in all Christian living is that we are to obey God because we have in us the spirit of obedience. Now what do I mean by the spirit of obedience? The spirit of obedience is that spirit or disposition or nature in the child which causes him to obey the parent. Well, let's do it with the full-grown Christian first of all, which causes the full-grown Christian to obey God as his chief and first delight. He wants to do it. He loves to do it. It's the most pleasant and happy thing for him to do. As the statement says, all true obedience comes from the heart. It was heart work with Christ, and if we consent, He will so identify himself with our thoughts and aims, so blend our hearts and minds into conformity to his will, that when obeying him, we shall be but carrying out our own impulses. The will, refined and sanctified, will find its highest delight in doing his service. The will find its highest delight in doing his service. When we know God as it is our privilege to know him, our life will be a life of continual obedience. It's an appreciation of the character of Christ. Through communion with God, sin will become hateful to us. That is the way that God designs his people to live. He doesn't want anyone to obey him because they are forced to obey him. He takes no pleasure in a forced allegiance. And the only kind of obedience that God is interested in is that kind of obedience which springs from the natural disposition of the heart, or of the inner nature, and wherein the person finds it his chief delight and pleasure to serve the God whom he serves. Now, if that is the way that the grown-up person is to behave, then is that not the way we're supposed to be built into the children, from infancy up? Right? And the objective, therefore, of every parent is to ensure that the spirit of obedience is built into the child. If you take time to observe your own children, or the children of others, not as a criticism but as a study, in order to gain an appreciation of these principles, and how frequently the parent will call upon the child to do something, and the child immediately begins to resist the desires of the parent, to cry, to fuss, to kick his heels around and to throw up his arms and so forth. And it's very, very evident that if that child is compelled to do what the parent wants, it's a very, very unhappy chore for the child to do it. And when we witness this kind of thing, we have to recognize the absence in the child of the spirit of obedience, right? The spirit of obedience is not there. Now, the point then comes, how do we obtain for our child the spirit of obedience? By what procedure or process is this achieved? And the answer, of course, lies in the way in which the adult who finally does obtain this will to serve God, and of course those of us who become Christians in later life usually do so despite our bad upbringing as children, instead of because of it or through it. We obtain this because the miracle-working power of God implants in the believer a new life principle altogether. It is by the preaching of the gospel and the application of the gospel, which is the power of God to save from sin, that the individual does receive the spirit of obedience. Now, realizing this, of course, it obviously follows that the way in which the child is to receive this experience is through the preaching of the gospel. So what then must parents be? They must be preachers of the gospel. They must be able to impart to their children the information about the gospel. They must be able to inspire in their children faith in the promises of God. And they must be able to lead them into a saved experience from their very, very earliest days. In fact, even before they can teach them verbally, they must be able to do this. Now, this means then that the first requisite of a successful parent is that he must himself understand the gospel of Jesus Christ. He must himself have experienced the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he must therefore be able to teach what he himself has experienced. If a person can't do these things, should he then undertake parenthood? The answer is obviously not, because he definitely is not qualified to occupy that kind of position. And for instance, we've stressed the point over the years that God only calls into his service those who are qualified by the presence of the gospel in them to occupy that particular position. And no man calls himself to this particular post or position either in the gospel ministry. So therefore, in like manner, no person should ever call himself into the office of a parent without he knows that God has specifically called him to occupy that place. And God will call no one to that place unless that person has the qualification to occupy that place. And of course, there are more qualifications than the one I'm just mentioning here. The father, for instance, must have the capacity to to supply his family with food and shelter and the necessities of life. He must be able to bear the responsibilities of a father and a husband, and so on and so on. But I'm mostly concerned at the moment, of course, with this main principle of bringing into the lives of our children the spirit of obedience. Now, when the parents then have obtained that qualification and are called to God to be parents, and God has brought together the man and the woman and they marry, and naturally, of course, any home that the Lord doesn't build is going to founder or fail sooner or later in some way or the other. And there are enough broken homes, of course, to prove that particular point. Then once they have come together and the child is conceived and is born, then those parents need to recognize the very simple fact that that child is born as a child of Satan on the spiritual side, and because of that has in him what kind of spirit? Spirit of obedience? No. The spirit of disobedience. And he must recognize the fact that the normal approach on the part of parents in dealing with the problem of the spirit of disobedience is to control it, to curb it, and to force it to obey, at least so far as the outward person is concerned. And he also needs to recognize that this is not the way of God's kingdom, because in God's kingdom, does he use force to exact obedience? No, he doesn't. That is not God's way. And if the child is to be brought up in the way that he should go, so that when he's old he doesn't depart from it, then from the earliest years he must be educated according to God's principles of education, which don't involve the use of force. Then when the parents, I should say, have this gift of a beautiful new life, they should then kneel down before God and by living faith confess on behalf of that child the presence in him of Satan's spirit, which in turn, of course, is the spirit of disobedience. And having confessed the presence of that spirit of disobedience, they should then ask God to remove that from the child and put into that child the spirit of obedience, which of course is the spirit of Jesus, which is the seed of Christ, which is the life of Christ, which is the character of Christ, and therefore the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Now, most parents, of course, have not known this before their babies are born. Many families, many children, of course, are amongst us today. And consequently, of course, the children are growing up to various age levels, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and more. And the children come to the place in some cases where they themselves can be verbally taught these principles. Now, in the case of a small child, shall we say a year old, that can't even talk yet and certainly can't hear the arguments the parents may present to it, when that child throws a temper tantrum or some such thing, then the mother and the father, or one or the other, if only one or the other is present, should quietly take that child aside and sit down with it and talk to it. And even though the child cannot understand the actual message being spoken to it, the atmosphere coming from a godly parent is going to surround that child with a sense of the power of God's presence, a thing to which children are very sensitive. They're very much aware of atmosphere around the person. And of course, as you know, there is a very powerful atmosphere which surrounds every individual, and the atmosphere is either good or it is evil. I'd like to just pause at this point to read a statement from the book Christ Object Lessons on the talent of influence, where Sister Wright makes this point very, very plain, that we do have an influence which either tells for good or it tells for evil, as the case may be, depending on what kind of person we are, what kind of relationship we have established with the God of heaven. Page 339 in the book Christ Object Lessons. 339 in the book Christ Object Lessons. Every soul is surrounded by an atmosphere of its own, an atmosphere, it may be, charged with the life-giving power of faith, courage and hope, and sweet with the fragrance of love. Or it may be heavy and chill with the gloom of discontent and selfishness, or poisonous with the deadly taint of cherished sin. By the atmosphere surrounding us, every person with whom we come in contact is consciously or unconsciously affected. Obviously then, when a child is born of parents in whom is also the spirit of disobedience, and those parents have an atmosphere which is heavy and chill with the gloom of discontent and selfishness, and or poisonous with a deadly taint of cherished sin, and when you add that atmosphere of disobedience to the spirit of disobedience in the child, then what is obviously going to be the result so far as the child is concerned? The very worst kind of result, obviously. But on the other hand, if a child is fortunate enough to be born to a Christian home, where the atmosphere is one of life-giving power, the life-giving power of faith, courage and hope, and sweet with the fragrance of love, then obviously that child has a greater advantage than the one who is born to a non-Christian home, because that atmosphere is going to have a very powerful influence upon the child. So as the parent draws near to his or her or their child in very deep trouble with a temper tantrum, manifesting the spirit of disobedience, then there is brought to the child the atmosphere of life-giving faith, hope and courage. And the parent needs to talk to the child, repeat the great promises of God, even though the child can't understand them, and then have the child kneel down with the parents while the parent prays on behalf of the child, confessing the spirit of disobedience and asking God to remove that spirit from that child and put into that child the spirit of obedience. Now, when the child has in him the sweet spirit of obedience, so that his greatest delight is to serve or to obey his parents, when every child in a Christian family is like that, then what a blessed and happy family that's going to be. Don't you... I can just imagine the parents at this moment saying, well, that's the kind of family I'd like to have, where that sweet element of accord and obedience is shared by parents and children as the chiefest delight comes to serve the God whom we all love. Now, of course, that's not the end of the story, not the end of the parent's responsibility. The parent stands in the place of God to the child, and the child's first conception of the character of God is given to it by the way in which the parents behave themselves in relationship to the child. And very obviously, of course, if the parents have made God to be their problem solver and ask the question day by day, what are my orders? And the child sees the very smooth and successful lives of their parents, and this gives the child, of course, a great sense of confidence in the God of heaven eventually. It builds an atmosphere in that direction. Now, when the parents then give directions to their children, that is, orders or commands, they stand in God's place in this respect. Now, God never gives to us a foolish order. He never gives a selfish order. He never gives an order which is unreasonable, and never gives one which can't be carried out. And obviously, of course, parents need to exercise wisdom in the way in which they manage their household and run their homes, so the orders they give their children can be obeyed by them, and will in the end prove to be beneficial and a blessing to the children as well. So these things, of course, are all very important parts of the training of the child in this respect. Now, so far, of course, we've not really had the opportunity of seeing this thing put into practice so far as the movement is concerned. It's only in the last few days I myself, for instance, have seen this principle of the spirit of disobedience versus the spirit of obedience. Now, I've come to realize that the only possible way in which a child can really be an obedient and blessed child is to have in him that spirit of obedience, which can only be put there by the miracle-working power of God as a result of the preaching of the gospel. Perhaps I shouldn't say we haven't seen it work yet, because in Portugal, which I mentioned I think last night, I saw there an astonishing transformation from a group of children who were very unmanageable, very, very difficult, to a group which now manifest a very different disposition altogether, and seem to find great pleasure in obeying their parents, who ask them to do things and they just do them when they're told, and I was quite impressed and amazed by the transformation. But I'd like today to challenge parents who have little children and babies and who have yet unborn children to very, very carefully consider these principles, study them, and put them into practice. And I do believe that if you yourselves have a rich experience in the Lord, if you believe the promises and know their power, if you impart the same experience to your children, if you uplift them in the arms of faith before God, asking Him to remove their evil spirit and give them the spirit of obedience, you'll see some astonishing changes take place in their lives. And of course, it'll be a very, very happy family situation if this is the case. I'd like now to go back to an Old Testament story to continue this principle of knowing God's commands on one hand, the promises on the other, and knowing these to obey the first and to trust the second. Let's turn back to an Old Testament story, 1 Kings chapters 13 and 14. And this, of course, is the story of when King Saul became impatient with Samuel for not arriving on time, and he offered the sacrifice which cost him the kingdom for the rest of his family and dynasty. 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 14. Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 13. And in verse 5 we read that the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude, and they came up and pitched in Michmash eastward from Bethaven. Now this was a very frightening spectacle for Israel. 30,000 chariots plus all those horsemen and all that great uncounted army of soldiers to battle against the Israelites. Now obviously Israel had a tremendous problem. And then it was that Samuel told King Saul to wait for 7 days until he should come down and offer a burnt offering and sacrifices with him. The reference to that is back in 1 Samuel 10 verse 8. 1 Samuel 10 verse 8. And thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down unto thee to offer burnt offerings, and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee, and show thee what thou shalt do. Now verse 9 says, and so that when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, God gave another heart, and all those signs came to pass that day. And the other heart, of course, was that he gained a new birth experience at that point of time. Now having a newborn experience, of course, which is the spirit of obedience, does not guarantee that a person is going to understand and follow God's ways in all things. The spirit of obedience is a matter of the heart and also a matter of the mind. It's both. In mind and heart we must understand that to obey God is better than sacrifice, and our first and most important responsibility. Now, going back to 1 Samuel chapter 13, we find in verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. That is, of course, all that were left followed him with trembling. And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. Now, this means, of course, that the pressure upon Saul was mounting. The threat of the Philistines was right there, and promised to cause the destruction of King Saul and his kingdom. And to make matters worse, the time went by, and Samuel did not appear as he promised to do. And so the pressure was mounting upon this king at this point of time. Now I'm very impressed with the fact that in story after story in the Bible, we find that time does exert an increasing pressure. I think, for instance, of Abraham and Sarah, they had the promise of the child that would be the father of the coming Messiah. But the years went by, and while they couldn't wait for a certain length of time, as the years went by and the pressure grew and grew, they finally succumbed to that pressure and did yield to that pressure, and they went about having a son whose name was Ishmael, who could never, of course, be the child of promise. And likewise with Jesus Christ upon the mountaintop, 40 days go by, 40 days when there's no food, 40 days without any word from God, and as the pressure of time went by, the pressure to succumb to temptation became greater and greater. Now likewise, King Saul was prepared to wait for 7 days, but not beyond that point of time. And when Samuel did not appear, then he stood up and offered the sacrifice himself. Verse 9, 1 Samuel chapter 13. And Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down upon me to Gilgal, and I had not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself therefore and offered a burnt offering. Now, it also appears again and again that when men give way to the pressure upon them to take the work into their own hands, as King Saul did, that to them it's very important that they serve the God of Israel. It's very important that they have God's power upon their side. They don't want to go out by themselves without God altogether, and they're not any religious people. For instance, when the Jews looked for their Messiah to come, they wanted the power of God to be added to their plans to give them victory over the Romans and make Israel the king nation in the entire world. And here we find King Saul too is very concerned that he does have the blessing of God, otherwise he feared that he would be unable to fight against the Philistines. We read on to verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly, thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee, for now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. And Samuel arose and gathered him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him about 600 men. A mere 600 men was all that was left at that point of time. Now I thought this was where the prophet said to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken on the fat of rams, if I'm mistaken. Does anyone know what that reference is? To obey is better than... Where is it again? 1 Samuel 15. Yeah, thank you very much. 1 Samuel 15, verse 22. Right. Now this was when Samuel came again to King Saul after the mistake on Saul's part in that he spared the Amalekite king Agag. And in verse 22 he says, and Samuel said, hath the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as a sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Here the point is made very strongly, of course, that to obey is the most important thing. It's better than sacrifice, and to hearken to God's word is better than the fat of rams. Now coming back to the story in the 13th chapter, when King Saul offered the sacrifice on his own behalf in order to gain the supposed blessing of God against the Philistines, what would have happened if King Saul had simply asked the question, what are my orders? And said to himself, that's all I have to concern myself about. And if when I concern myself about the orders of God, and that obedience on my part leads to the total defeat of the army, if that does happen, then that's not my responsibility. God must bear that responsibility, because if God gives bad orders, and the result is disaster, then who must bear the responsibility? God must. But if God gives orders and we disobey those orders in preference for orders that we think are better, and then comes disaster, then who bears the responsibility? We do. And of course King Saul most certainly bore the responsibility back there for what might have happened and would have happened if God had not worked a wonderful deliverance through Jonathan and his armor bearer. So in the case of King Saul, then we have the same point illustrated very clearly and plainly, that to obey is better than any other kind of service, even a sacrifice. And when we sacrifice for the cause of God, sacrifice our time, our money, our talents, and all the rest of it for the cause of God, then we expect God to be approving of what we have done. But what does God really approve of? Obedience. And we might go out and do all kinds of very wonderful missionary work. We might go out and heal the sick or treat the sick and give them relief. We might go out and feed the hungry and clothe the naked. But unless this is done in obedience to God's commands, unless he's the plan maker and the problem solver and burden bearer, then of course God is not very pleased with the results at all. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 7, for instance, to note again the words of Christ to a large number of people in the Great Judgment Day. Very familiar verses, of course. We've known and read previously. Matthew chapter 7, and we start with verse 21. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name have done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, you that work iniquity. So here's the people then who, at great sacrifice to themselves, and confident they're building up God's kingdom, have gone out and done all these great things. They've taught in Christ's name. They've prophesied in thy name. In his name have cast out devils, and in God's name have done many, many wonderful works. When they come before God, pointing to all these great things they've done for him and in his name, you'll simply say to this class of people, I never knew you, depart from me, you that work iniquity. Now what makes their work iniquitous? That's the question we have to look into at the moment. It is the fact that they've gone out to manifest their own righteousness instead of being God's instruments to manifest his righteousness. Now some folk may say, well, that makes God a very selfish God. He only wants himself to be exalted and honoured and glorified and so forth. He likes praise, he's praise hungry, and he's very, very jealous of nobody else but he ever receives such praise. And we must recognise, of course, there's a very, very false understanding of God's character. That God is not selfish, he's not praise hungry, but he is very intelligent, very wise. And God knows perfectly well that when men receive praise and adoration to themselves, that which they've never done anyway, particularly, that this leads to their own self-destruction. He wants us to recognise that he is the source of life, that he is the plan maker and burden bearer, because he alone has the capacity to occupy that position. He alone. And while we understand that fact, and therefore depend continually upon God for what he alone can do for us, we are then safe from the dreadful problem of self-sufficiency, self-confidence, and consequent separation from the God of heaven. So the story of King Saul is a very graphic illustration of this very, very vital principle, that to obey is the most important thing. Obedience and faith make up a holy life. Let's go back now to Revelation chapter 3 to look further into the Philadelphian message, which as I say, I believe to be very much a message of present truth for the time in which we live today. Because God right now is working very, very hard, very diligently to bring out a people who meet the specifications laid down in this passage of Scripture, and which qualifications, when achieved, will be the fitness at last for the people through whom the work will be finally finished. Now I'm going to run ahead just a little bit now, and then I want to tie all these various points together as we progress. Now, Revelation 3 and verse 8, I know thy works. Well, I should go back a little bit, first of all, to verse 7. These things have he that is holy. And we're going to have a lot more to say about the holy life of Jesus Christ as the week goes by. But for a moment, we'll move on so we can tie certain things together and make the word he is holy much more pertinent and clear. These things have he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, he that openeth and no man shutteth, and shutteth and no man openeth. I know thy works, behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Now, first of all, we find that Christ has set before us an open door. And in the spirit of prophecy, Sister White makes particular application of the open door to the open door into the most holy place, which was opened in 1844 at the end of the 2,300-day period. Now, we've had studies before in our camp meetings, which I shan't repeat today, but I would like to just remind you of them. And very, very briefly, just a quick review, and anyone who hasn't heard this point can ask questions. I'll be glad to talk to them aside later. But I know you don't want me to repeat too much of the past material. You'd like to advance into new fields of study. Now, when back in Daniel 8, verse 13 and 14, the question was first of all asked in verse 13, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the abomination of desolation to give birth to the sanctuary and the host of trodden underfoot? And the answer was 2,300 days. Then shall the sanctuary be restored to its rightful place or rightful state, or it shall be cleansed, as various translations render that particular passage. Now, in Daniel chapter 12, the question was, how long to the end of these wonders? And the answer was 1260 days, which in turn, of course, is 1260 years. And the wonder that would cease at the end of that time period was the wonder that Satan's forces could so successfully and repeatedly gain the ascendancy over God's true church, which was blessed with the almighty power of God and his word. That's a wonder, because when you consider what God's people have on their side, then they would be invincible. They would know no such thing as failure, loss, impossibility, or defeat. As I said in the first lines in the Sabbath Rest book, in chapter 1 and the first pages of that chapter, in the lives of those who enter into God's Sabbath rest, nothing can go wrong. That may take a lot of believing, mightn't it? Until we understand, of course, the living power of God. The present world is yet to witness a living, effective demonstration of this, and until it does, it'll be highly skeptical of this assertion. But such a demonstration is soon to be given by a dedicated company of believers to whom God will reveal what might have been received, experienced, and accomplished millenniums ago. When that day comes, Satan will be utterly vanquished and sin ended, and Christ will return on the clouds of heaven. This is the fulfillment the church has been long awaited, but never realized, because the members have not known and undeviatingly lived in God's Sabbath rest. The wonder is not that time has been so, the wonder is that time has now tarried so long, when God's folk had so much upon their side to guarantee a very speedy success to God's plan to re-establish righteousness among mankind. And when Daniel, of course, heard that question asked, how long shall be the vision, he looked back over the previous centuries, almost millenniums as well, when he saw a continual overthrow of God's people, followed by a restoration of them, another overthrow, another restoration. And while this went on, the work of God in the world could not be finished. There was no possibility of that. Now, there's a good reason for this, of course, and it is this. In order for God to command these people, he must have communication with them. He must have communication with them. The last chapter in the book on God's Sabbath rest is called The Living Connection. Those of you who have read the book will remember that. And when we think in terms of the human body as being a type or a picture of the Church of God upon this earth, and in the body we have one head and many members, right? Now, for the members to function, what must there be between the head and the members? There must be communication. There must be a living connection. Without the living connection, how can the members function? That's impossible. See, my finger, for instance, is a member. My mind is saying to it to wriggle up and down, so it wiggles up and down. Okay? Now, if I cut this finger off and put it over here on the edge of the desk, is there now a connection? I'm not going to do it, by the way. Is there now a living connection between that finger and the head? Can the finger now obey the head? That's an absolute impossibility. Now, what was the means, or what is the means of communication between earth and heaven? The sanctuary, right? And the continual ministry of Jesus Christ. Take away from the believer the sanctuary of truth, in which is found our great high priest, standing right there in the very presence of God, and take that away from God, take away the daily and the sanctuary, and what communication do we have with heaven? We have none. And when there's no communication between God and his people, then how can the people of God function victoriously over the enemies of truth? Again, the answer is impossible. It can't be done. Now, do you suppose Satan knows this? He most certainly knows this. And this is why he is always targeted to destroy the communication center between God and his people. Always. So every time that the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Jebusites or the Midianites came against the people of God, what was the first thing they did? They took away the daily, they cast down the sanctuary, and they oppressed the people of God. That was always their first work. And when God in turn sent a mighty champion like Gideon or Deborah or Samson or these other men and women that came, then when those men successfully drove out the enemy, what was the first thing they re-established? The communication center, right? The sanctuary and the daily services. That was the first thing they always replaced. Now, they'd hardly replaced it, of course, when another rebellion followed, and with the next rebellion coming up, again the communication center was broken down, again God's folk found them separated from their head, and again the members of the church could not function successfully in their war against the enemy. Now, prior to Daniel's day, there had been thousands of, well, yes, I guess we can safely say several thousand years of this. Many centuries, of course, from Joshua's time to Daniel's time. And Daniel knew perfectly well that while this pattern continued, there was no possibility of God's work in the world being finished, as it could have been right back in Joshua's day. Because Paul says in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, that if Joshua had given them rest, then we not afterward have spoken of another day, saying, today if you'll hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. The work of God did not have to wait until our day to be finished. It could be finished many, many millenniums ago. And it wasn't because God's people never availed themselves of the mighty provision which God had to offer them to finish the work. Now, when God in turn showed Daniel a future which seemed to be a sad repetition of the past, he asked the question, how long shall this thing go on? And the answer, 2,300 days. Now, we'll leave the study period at this point as my time has now run out. So I'm bound, of course, to 45 minutes on the tapes. We'll pick this thread up again when we meet together in our next study period in just a few minutes' time.